Your GPS will route you around them. Google Earth blacks out their satellite images, but thousands of people still drive into these 8 Appalachian towns every year. The question isn't why they go in, it's why absolutely none of them ever come back out. Deep beneath the streets of Centralia, Pennsylvania, something has been burning for over 60 years. Not a campfire that went out of control, not a house fire that spread too far. We're talking about an underground coal fire that started in 1962 and shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. Here's how this whole mess began. The town needed to clean up their local dump before Memorial Day weekend. Simple enough, right? Well, someone decided the easiest way to handle all that trash was to burn it. Makes sense for 1962. But here's where things went sideways. That burning dump sat right next to an old coal mine entrance. The fire didn't just burn the garbage and call it a day, it found its way into the coal seams running underneath the entire town. Coal burns differently than wood or paper. Once it catches fire underground, it can smolder for decades without anyone even noticing. The Centralia fire spread through miles of coal veins beneath people's homes, schools, and businesses. Residents started noticing weird things happening. Their basement walls got hot to the touch. Steam rose from cracks in their driveways. The ground became warm enough that snow would melt in perfect circles during winter. Then there's the really dangerous part. Burning coal produces carbon monoxide, the invisible, odorless gas that can kill you before you even realize something's wrong. People in Centralia started getting headaches and feeling dizzy for no apparent reason. One day in 1979, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his backyard when the ground literally opened up beneath his feet. He fell into a sinkhole filled with deadly gas and only survived because his cousin pulled him out just in time. That incident changed everything. The federal government finally admitted this wasn't just a local problem anymore. They started testing the air quality and found carbon monoxide levels that could kill a person within minutes. But here's the kicker. The fire had spread so far underground that stopping it would cost more money than the entire town was worth. The government's solution? Buy everyone out and relocate them. Sounds reasonable until you remember that most of these families had lived in Centralia for generations. Their great-grandparents had built these homes, their kids played on these streets. Their whole lives were rooted in this community. And now someone was telling them they had to leave because the ground beneath their feet was literally on fire. Most residents took the buyout money and moved away during the 1980s and 1990s. The government demolished their homes and covered the lots with dirt. Route 61, the main highway running through town, developed massive cracks from the underground heat. Instead of fixing it, officials just closed that section and built a detour around it. Nature started taking over the abandoned road, and now it looks like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. But not everyone left. A handful of stubborn residents refused to go. They fought the government in court for years, arguing that their specific properties weren't dangerous. These holdouts, fewer than 5 people now, still live in Centralia today. Their houses sit isolated among empty lots where their neighbors' homes used to stand. Walking through modern Centralia feels surreal. You'll see a few occupied houses scattered across blocks of empty land. The old highway is buried under dirt and gravel, though some sections still peek through. Graffiti covers parts of the abandoned road, left by visitors who trek out to see this bizarre place for themselves. Steam still rises from cracks in the ground on cold days, reminding everyone that the fire continues burning below. The strangest part? That underground fire could keep burning for another 200 years, maybe longer. The coal seams run deep and wide beneath this part of Pennsylvania. Engineers estimate there's enough fuel down there to feed this fire well into the 23rd century. Centralia's cemetery remains one of the few places that looks normal. Headstones from the 1800s and early 1900s mark generations of families who lived and died here long before anyone imagined their town would become famous for burning from the inside out. It's oddly peaceful, considering you're standing above an active coal fire. The fire spread across roughly 400 acres underground. Surface temperatures in some spots reach over 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The air quality remains dangerous in certain areas, even decades after most people left. What makes Centralia's story even more striking is how quickly a thriving community can disappear when the foundation literally becomes unstable. But Pennsylvania's coal country holds many more tales of towns that flourished and faded for different reasons entirely. While Centralia burns slowly underground, some towns die much faster. Jewell Valley, Virginia, didn't get 60 years to say goodbye. One day, people were living normal lives. The next, they were packing everything they owned into trucks and never looking back. Built in the 1930s as a coal camp, Jewell Valley was supposed to be a permanent home for mining families. The company promised steady work and decent housing. For decades, it actually delivered. Kids rode bikes between rows of identical company houses while their fathers disappeared into the earth each morning, emerging black with coal dust each evening. The camp store sold everything from work boots to birthday cake ingredients. Life had a rhythm here, predictable as a mining shift change. Then the ownership started changing hands and changing again and again. Different companies bought and sold Jewell Valley like a used car nobody really wanted but couldn't quite get rid of either. Each new owner promised improvements, better conditions, more jobs. What they delivered was confusion and neglect. Buildings started falling apart. Equipment got older and more dangerous. The promises got emptier, but here's where things get really ugly. In the early 1980s, something went seriously wrong with the water supply. Nobody talks much about exactly what happened, but whatever contaminated those wells did it fast and did it thoroughly. Suddenly, the water that families had been drinking for decades became dangerous. Not dangerous like maybe you shouldn't drink too much of this. Dangerous, more like get out of town immediately, or risk serious health problems. Dangerous, the evacuation wasn't the orderly, planned kind you see in disaster movies. People grabbed what they could carry and left everything else behind. Family photos still hung on walls. Dishes sat unwashed in sinks, work clothes hung on clotheslines, waiting for owners who would never come back to collect them. What happened next surprised even the locals who thought they'd seen everything. Most abandoned towns take years or decades to completely disappear. Buildings slowly collapse. Nature gradually reclaims the land. Vandals and scrap metal hunters pick away at what's left until finally there's nothing but foundations and memories. Jewell Valley vanished, like someone hit fast forward on a demolition video. The camp store, which had been the heart of the community for 50 years, disappeared so quickly that people couldn't figure out how it happened. Did someone tear it down? Did it collapse on its own? Did scrappers take it apart piece by piece? Nobody seems to know for sure, and the few people willing to talk about it give different answers every time you ask. Then there's the matter of those strange local stories. You know how every abandoned place eventually collects ghost stories and urban legends? Well, Jewell Valley's got some unusual ones. People who venture into what's left of the camp report hearing machinery sounds, the rumble of mining equipment, the screech of metal on metal, voices calling out shift changes. Makes sense, right? Except the mining operation shut down before the town was abandoned, and the sounds people describe don't match the equipment that was actually used there. Local hunters and hikers started avoiding the area, not because they were scared of ghosts, but because the noises were so realistic, they worried about trespassing on an active work site. More than one person drove up expecting to find a construction crew and instead found empty foundations and overgrown roads. And the weird part is how quickly the forest moved back in. Usually it takes nature years to reclaim developed land. Trees need time to grow, brush needs seasons to spread. Jewell Valley got swallowed up by vegetation so fast it looked like the land was hungry for it. Within a few years of abandonment, you needed a GPS and a machete to find where the main street used to be. The contamination that forced everyone out remains a mystery too. Different sources blame different things. Chemical spills, mining runoff, industrial accidents. But getting specific details proves nearly impossible. Either the records disappeared along with everything else, or somebody worked very hard to make sure those records stayed buried. When government agencies and mining companies both refuse to talk about the same incident, you know something went seriously wrong. Today you'd be hard-pressed to prove Jewell Valley ever existed without old county maps and a few faded photographs. The road that used to lead there is barely passable. The water that caused all the trouble still flows through the area, though nobody's testing it these days. What makes Jewell Valley different from other abandoned mining communities isn't just how fast it disappeared, but how completely it was erased. While some ghost towns become tourist attractions or historical curiosities, this one seems determined to stay forgotten. Maybe that's for the best, considering how it ended. Speaking of endings that nobody saw coming, There's another mining town that's been dying so slowly, most people haven't noticed it's almost gone. From underground fires to contaminated water, America's coal towns have faced their share of disasters. But what happens when a town doesn't disappear overnight? What if it just slowly bleeds out over decades? Gary, West Virginia tells that story perfectly. This wasn't a place that vanished in a dramatic puff of smoke or got evacuated because of toxic waste. Gary died the slow death that most coal towns face, one closed mine, one empty house, one moving truck at a time. Back in its heyday, Gary was the kind of place that made U.S. Steel executives smile when they looked at their profit reports. The company built this town in the early 1900s, and by the mid-20th century, it was humming with activity. Thousands of people called Gary home. The mines ran 3 shifts a day. Kids walked to school on paved streets while their fathers disappeared into the earth to pull out the black gold that powered America's industrial boom. The town was so proud of its mining heritage that the local high school chose coal diggers as their mascot. Think about that for a second. Most schools pick eagles or tigers or warriors. Gary picked coal diggers. That tells you everything about how central mining was to this community's identity. Friday night football games must have been something else. Imagine the opposing team trying to trash talk the coal diggers. U.S. Steel poured money into Gary like it was building a permanent monument to coal. The company constructed solid brick buildings, wide streets, and all the infrastructure a thriving mining town needed. They weren't planning for Gary to be a temporary operation. This was supposed to be forever. Then the 1970s arrived with bad news. The coal seams that had made Gary profitable for decades were running thin. U.S. Steel started doing the math, and the numbers weren't adding up anymore. Mining companies are brutally practical. When the coal gets harder to reach and more expensive to extract, they pack up and leave. No sentimental speeches, no gradual transitions, just pink slips and padlocked gates. The population started hemorrhaging almost immediately. Families who had lived in Gary for generations suddenly found themselves staring at a terrible choice: stay in a town with no jobs or abandon everything they'd ever known to start over somewhere else. Most chose to leave. Can you blame them? But here's where Gary's story gets particularly haunting. Unlike towns that get completely abandoned, Gary didn't empty out all at once. People trickled away year after year, decade after decade. The town kept breathing, but barely. Today, roughly 700 people still call Gary home, a fraction of its former population. Walk through Gary now, and you'll see the bones of what used to be. The high school where coal diggers once roamed the halls sits abandoned, its windows dark and classrooms silent. Roads that once carried mining trucks and family cars are crumbling into potholes and weeds. Houses that once sheltered mining families now stand empty, their front porches sagging under the weight of decades and neglect. The weird part is how normal some of it still looks. This isn't a ghost town in the Hollywood sense. There are still people here, still a few businesses hanging on, still signs of life scattered throughout the community. It's more like watching a town in slow motion collapse. You can see what Gary used to be, but you can also see exactly where it's headed. Some of the abandoned homes still have personal belongings inside. Family photos on mantles, dishes in kitchen cabinets. It's as if families just stepped out for groceries and never came back, which in many cases is probably close to what actually happened. When your paycheck disappears and your town has no economic future, you don't always have time for a proper goodbye. Local residents who've stuck it out will tell you Gary isn't dead yet. They point to community events, local pride, and their determination to keep their hometown alive, and they're not wrong. Gary is still technically a functioning town, but the math is pretty unforgiving. Every year more people leave than arrive. Every year more buildings stand empty than get occupied. The truly sad irony is that Gary was built to last. U.S. Steel didn't construct flimsy temporary buildings when they developed this town. They built solid permanent structures designed to house generations of mining families. Those buildings are still standing today, which makes the abandonment even more striking. It's like finding a perfectly good car rusting in someone's driveway. Gary represents something much bigger than just one West Virginia town. It's the slow-motion version of what happened to coal communities across America. Not every coal town got the dramatic exit of Centralia's underground fire or sudden evacuation orders. Most just withered away gradually, year by year, family by family. Speaking of dramatic exits, though, some coal towns did get the full disaster treatment. Take Lynch, Kentucky, where ambition once built something truly spectacular. U.S. Steel didn't mess around when they decided to build the perfect mining town in 1917. They picked a spot in the mountains of Kentucky, looked at the coal seams running through the hills like black gold highways, and said, "We're building something special here." Lynch wasn't just going to be another rough mining camp where workers lived in shacks and prayed their paychecks would come on time. This was going to be different. The company wanted a model community, whatever that meant back then. Turns out it meant everything a small town could dream of having. Lynch got a state-of-the-art hospital when most rural areas barely had doctors. The school system was so advanced that kids from other towns wished they could attend. And the company store? It wasn't your typical overpriced mining camp ripoff joint. This place stocked everything from fresh produce to fancy household goods that you'd normally have to travel to big cities to find. By the 1920s, Lynch was absolutely booming. 10,000 people called it home. That's more than some county seats could claim. The streets buzzed with activity from sunrise to well past sunset. Miners heading to their shifts, kids running to school, wives shopping at stores that actually had choices. Modern technology arrived faster in Lynch than in most American towns. Electric streetlights lit the main roads when neighboring communities were still using oil lamps. But here's the thing about company towns. They live and die by one thing only: coal. When the coal keeps flowing, everything works like clockwork. When it doesn't, well, that's when things get interesting in all the wrong ways. Lynch learned this lesson the hard way, though it took decades for the reality to sink in. The town's golden years stretched longer than most mining communities ever experienced. Through the Great Depression, World War II, and into the post-war boom, Lynch kept humming along. The mines produced tons of coal every single day. U.S. Steel made profits that would make today's tech companies jealous. Workers earned decent wages and actually had job security, something that sounds almost mythical now. Then there's the community spirit that developed. When you've got 10,000 people living in a planned town surrounded by mountains, they either learn to get along or everything falls apart. Lynch chose the first option. The high school football games drew crowds from miles around. The company sponsored community events that brought families together every weekend. Church attendance was high, crime was low, and most people genuinely believed they were living the American dream. The hospital became legendary throughout eastern Kentucky. People traveled for hours just to get treated there, because the medical equipment and staff quality surpassed anything available for hundreds of miles. Babies were born, broken bones were set, and serious illnesses were treated with a level of care that rivaled big city hospitals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Coal mining, one of the most dangerous jobs in America, had created a town with some of the best healthcare around. And the weird part is how quickly it all started unraveling in the 1980s. Coal production began dropping as seams played out and cheaper sources opened elsewhere. U.S. Steel made corporate decisions based on profit margins, not community loyalty. Jobs disappeared faster than anyone expected. Families who had lived in Lynch for generations suddenly found themselves with two choices: stay in a dying town or pack up everything and start over somewhere else. Most chose to leave. The population dropped from 10,000 to a few thousand, then kept falling. The hospital closed because there weren't enough patients to keep it profitable. The school consolidated with neighboring districts as enrollment plummeted. Store after store shut down when there weren't enough customers to justify staying open. What makes Lynch different from other abandoned mining towns is that the buildings didn't just vanish or get torn down. Many of the homes are still there, sitting empty but intact. Streets still exist even though grass grows through cracks in the pavement. You can walk through neighborhoods where every house tells a story about families who once called this place home. The population keeps shrinking every decade, but Lynch refuses to completely disappear. A few hundred people still live there, maintaining what's left of the community spirit that once made the town special. They organize small festivals, keep the remaining businesses running, and take care of the historic buildings that remind everyone what Lynch used to be. Walking through Lynch today feels like stepping through a time machine that got stuck between decades. The bones of that model community are still visible if you know where to look, but the energy, the bustling activity, the sense that this place had a bright future ahead. Speaking of towns that refuse to completely fade away, there's another place where the past still echoes through empty streets, though its story involves railroad money instead of mining profits. Lynch had its moments of glory, but when it comes to pure excess and wild money, nothing quite matches what happened in Thurmond, West Virginia. This tiny spot along the New River became one of the richest towns per capita in America during its peak years. Hard to believe when you see it today. Back in the early 1900s, Thurmond wasn't just another coal town, it was the coal town. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway made this place their main hub for moving coal out of West Virginia, and money flowed like water. We're talking serious cash here, the kind that made bankers from Charleston drive hours just to set up shop. The town had everything a boom community could want. Two full-service banks competed for business right across from each other. Multiple hotels catered to traveling salesmen, railroad executives, and anyone else with pockets full of coal money. The depot alone handled more freight tonnage than cities 10 times Thurmond's size. But here's where things get interesting. When Prohibition hit in 1920, most of America went dry. Well, most of America except Thurmond. The town basically ignored the law completely. Illegal saloons operated openly, poker games ran around the clock, and whiskey flowed as freely as before. Federal agents rarely bothered traveling to this remote railroad town tucked deep in the West Virginia mountains. Local stories claim the gambling got so intense that men would bet their entire paychecks on a single hand of cards. Others wagered their houses, their mining equipment, even their wives' jewelry. The railroad workers and coal executives had money to burn, and burn it they did. One particular legend tells of a poker game that lasted 3 straight days, with the winner walking away owning half the buildings on Main Street. Railroad money kept everything moving smoothly for decades. Trains loaded with coal rolled through Thurmond every few minutes during peak hours. The sound of steam engines, grinding wheels, and shouting workers never stopped. Night and day, this place hummed with activity that made nearby towns jealous. Then there was the Glen Hotel, Thurmond's crown jewel. This wasn't some basic boarding house. It featured electric lights, running water, and fancy dining rooms that served meals on real china. Traveling businessmen would book rooms weeks in advance just to experience Thurmond's hospitality. The hotel's bar allegedly served the finest whiskey between Charleston and Richmond. Money flowed so freely that locals joke about using $20 bills to light their cigars. Whether that actually happened, who knows? But the stories give you an idea of how wealthy this little railroad town became. Bank deposits reached levels that impressed financial experts from across the state. Everything seemed perfect until reality caught up. The first major blow came from flooding. The New River, which had provided transportation advantages for decades, turned destructive. Multiple floods wiped out railroad infrastructure, damaged buildings, and made business operations increasingly difficult. Insurance companies started refusing to cover properties in Thurmond's flood zone. Fire added insult to injury. Several devastating blazes swept through the business district, destroying hotels, saloons, and shops that had defined the town's character. The Glen Hotel, once Thurmond's pride and joy, suffered major fire damage and never fully recovered. Other businesses simply chose not to rebuild. Railroad technology changes hurt even more. Diesel engines replaced steam locomotives, reducing the need for frequent stops and maintenance. Coal transportation methods modernized, allowing trains to pass through Thurmond without stopping. The depot that once bustled with activity became increasingly quiet. By the 1950s, most businesses had closed permanently. The banks packed up and left for larger cities. Hotels boarded their windows and locked their doors for good. Railroad workers moved to active rail centers where jobs still existed. The population dropped from hundreds to dozens within a single decade. Today, Thurmond feels like stepping back in time, but not in a good way. Fewer than 5 people call this place home as of the 2020 census. The old railroad depot still stands, now serving as a National Park Service visitor center. A few original buildings remain, but most are empty shells of their former selves. Walking through modern Thurmond, you'll find it hard to believe this place once had more millionaires per capita than New York City. The abandoned structures and overgrown lots tell a different story than the wild prosperity that once defined this community. Train tracks still run through town, but modern locomotives rarely slow down enough for passengers to get a good look. The New River continues flowing past Thurmond just as it did during boom times, but instead of carrying prosperity, it now seems to whisper stories of a town that burned too bright and too fast. Sometimes the biggest fires create the most spectacular crashes. Speaking of crashes and toxic legacies, there's another mining town that makes Thurmond's decline look gentle by comparison. This next place didn't just lose its economy. It became literally too dangerous for human life. While most mining towns died slowly from economic decline, Picher, Oklahoma decided to go out with a bang. Well, more like a toxic whimper that lasted decades. This wasn't your typical coal town story. Picher made its fortune digging up lead and zinc, and by the time the last shovel hit the dirt, the place had become one of America's most poisoned communities. The town started booming in 1914 when miners discovered massive deposits of lead and zinc ore beneath the prairie. Within years, Picher transformed from empty grassland into a bustling industrial hub. At its peak, the town housed over 20,000 people who worked the mines or supported the families who did. The money flowed like water, and everyone thought the good times would last forever. But here's where Picher's story gets darker than a mine shaft at midnight. The mining companies weren't exactly concerned with environmental safety back then. They dumped millions of tons of contaminated mining waste, called chat piles, right next to where people lived, worked, and sent their kids to school. These massive gray mountains of toxic debris became the town's most recognizable landmarks. Children played on them like they were jungle gyms made of poison. The real nightmare began when scientists started testing the local kids for lead poisoning in the 1990s. The results were absolutely horrifying. Nearly every child in Picher had dangerously high levels of lead in their blood. Lead poisoning causes learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and long-term health issues that never go away. The town that parents thought was a great place to raise families had become a death trap for the next generation. Then there's the issue of what miners call subsidence. When you spend decades digging enormous holes underground, the surface eventually decides it doesn't want to stay put anymore. Houses in Picher began sinking into the earth without warning. Roads cracked and buckled. Buildings tilted at crazy angles like something out of a funhouse. Walking around town became a gamble. You never knew if the ground beneath your feet would hold. The Environmental Protection Agency declared Picher part of the largest environmental disaster site in American history. The entire area became known as the Tar Creek Superfund site, covering over 40 square miles of contaminated land. The cleanup costs were estimated at over $400 million, which was more money than anyone wanted to spend on a dying mining town. Local families faced an impossible choice: stay in their homes and watch their children suffer from lead poisoning, or abandon everything they'd built and start over somewhere else. Most chose their kids' health over their property values. Who could blame them? The final blow came in 2006 when a massive sinkhole opened up near the local school. The hole was so deep you couldn't see the bottom, and it kept growing larger every day. That's when the federal government stepped in with emergency buyout programs, essentially paying people to leave before the town killed them. By 2009, Picher officially disincorporated. The post office closed, the police department shut down, and the town ceased to exist on paper. The few remaining residents were technically living in an unincorporated area that happened to have some old buildings scattered around. Most of the houses, schools, and businesses were demolished to prevent people from moving back. Walking through modern-day Picher feels like visiting an alien planet. The chat piles still tower over empty lots where neighborhoods used to be. Concrete foundations mark spots where families once gathered for Sunday dinners. Street signs point to roads that lead nowhere, and the high school football field grows wild with weeds that no one will ever cut again. The water is still contaminated. The soil is still toxic. The underground mines are still collapsing. Picher didn't just die, it became uninhabitable. The town literally poisoned itself to death while trying to make a living. What makes Picher's story especially tragic is how preventable it all was. The mining companies knew their waste was dangerous, but dumping it safely would have cost money. The government agencies that should have protected residents didn't start paying attention until children were already permanently damaged. Everyone involved chose short-term profits over long-term consequences. The few people who still live in the area are mostly elderly folks who refuse to leave their homes, even when the government offered to buy them out. They tend small gardens in poisoned soil and drink bottled water while watching the last remnants of their community slowly crumble into the unstable ground. But Picher's toxic legacy isn't unique in America's mining regions. Deep in the forested hills of West Virginia, another community disappeared for different reasons, though the ending was just as final. Deep in the mountains of Mingo County, West Virginia, where the forest grows thick and the roads wind like forgotten prayers, sits what's left of Glen Alum. Well, sits might be too generous a word. More like slowly dissolves back into the earth that birthed it. This wasn't always a place where nature ruled. Glen Alum started life as a coal camp, carved right out of the wilderness in the early 1900s. The name itself tells you everything. Glen for the valley it nestled in, alum for the mineral-rich soil that promised prosperity. But here's the thing about promises made by coal companies: they have expiration dates nobody bothers to mention up front. At its peak, Glen Alum buzzed with life. Miners' families called this remote hollow home. Kids walked dirt paths to a one-room schoolhouse every morning. The post office handled mail from relatives in distant cities, carrying news and money orders that kept families connected to the outside world. Dozens of company houses lined the main road, their front porches alive with conversation after long shifts underground. But the weird part is how completely a place can vanish when the economic lifeline gets cut. When the coal seams played out and the company packed up, Glen Alum didn't just decline, it practically evaporated. One day there were paychecks and purpose. The next day, families loaded trucks with whatever they could carry and drove away forever. The buildings they left behind? Most folks expected them to stand empty for a while, maybe get sold off or torn down eventually. Nobody predicted how fast the forest would reclaim its territory. West Virginia mountains don't mess around when it comes to taking back what was theirs originally. Within a decade, vines started climbing the sides of abandoned houses. Tree roots pushed through foundation stones like they were made of cardboard. The roads that once carried coal trucks and school buses disappeared under layers of fallen leaves and new growth. Nature doesn't wait for permission slips when it decides to remodel. Let's not forget that Glen Alum wasn't built to last anyway. Coal camps were temporary by design, even when nobody said so out loud. Company houses got thrown together with cheap lumber and basic materials. Why invest in permanence when the coal underneath your feet had a limited supply? Makes sense from a business perspective, but it guaranteed these communities would crumble fast once abandoned. Walking through Glen Alum today, if you can find it, feels like archaeology in real time. Foundation stones peek through thick underbrush. Rusted pieces of mining equipment hide behind trees that weren't there 30 years ago. The old school bell might still be buried somewhere under decades of leaves and debris. And the cemetery? That's where Glen Alum's story gets really interesting. While houses collapse and roads vanish, headstones endure. They're stubborn that way. The local cemetery still marks where this community existed, with names and dates proving real families lived, worked, and died in this now invisible town. Some graves date back to the camp's earliest days, when mining accidents claimed young men and harsh winters took children. Then there are the mining relics scattered throughout the hollow. Pieces of equipment too heavy or worthless to haul away when the operation shut down. Old rail ties from tracks that once carried coal cars down the mountain. Metal fragments that might have been part of conveyor systems or processing equipment. The forest has wrapped around these remnants like a museum curator with a sense of humor. But here's what nobody talks about. Glen Alum represents something bigger than just another failed coal town. It shows how completely a community can disappear when its reason for existing vanishes overnight. Other ghost towns leave behind buildings or landmarks. Glen Alum chose a different path, total surrender to the wilderness that was there first. Local historians estimate fewer than 100 people ever called Glen Alum home at any given time. Compare that to bigger mining towns, and Glen Alum barely registers as a footnote. Yet its complete disappearance makes it more haunting than places with thousands of empty buildings. There's something unsettling about a town that doesn't just die, it gets erased entirely. The few people who remember Glen Alum describe it as peaceful but isolated. Getting supplies meant long trips to larger towns. Medical emergencies could turn deadly before help arrived. Kids who wanted education beyond elementary school had to leave home entirely. Life was hard even when the mines ran full tilt. Today, finding Glen Alum requires local knowledge and serious hiking boots. GPS won't help much when the roads disappeared decades ago. But some stories stick around longer than the places that created them. Stories about families who built lives in impossible places, then watched those places return to forest when the coal ran out. Speaking of places where violence left deeper scars than economic collapse, just down the mountain sits Matewan, where labor disputes once turned deadly and legends refused to stay buried. Most mining towns die quietly, their stories buried beneath years of neglect and forgotten dreams. But Matewan, well, this place went out with a bang that echoed through American labor history. Actually, several bangs, and the echoes still bounce around these West Virginia hollows today. May 19, 1920. That's the date burned into this town's memory like a brand on cattle. The Matewan massacre wasn't just another mining dispute. It was a full-blown shootout that turned Main Street into something resembling the Wild West. 10 people died in less than 3 minutes. Blood pooled on the wooden sidewalks while smoke drifted from rifle barrels. The whole thing started because coal miners wanted to join a union, and the mine owners really didn't want that to happen. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The town's police chief, Sid Hatfield, wasn't your typical lawman. He sided with the miners against the coal company's private detectives. These detectives had come to evict miners from company housing, basically kicking families onto the street for daring to organize. Hatfield told them they had no authority in his town. The detectives disagreed, violently. When the gunfire stopped, 7 detectives lay dead, along with 2 miners and the mayor. Sid Hatfield walked away without a scratch, instantly becoming a folk hero to working people across the country. The man had nerves of steel and aim to match. But heroes in coal country don't usually get happy endings. The Norfolk and Western Railway made Matewan crucial for moving coal out of these mountains. Trains rolled through constantly, their whistles echoing off the steep hillsides that boxed the town in on all sides. Money flowed like the Tug Fork River that runs alongside Main Street. Hotels, stores, banks, everything a booming coal town needed. The population swelled as miners and their families poured in, looking for steady work and decent wages. Then there's the aftermath of that famous shootout, which somehow managed to make things even bloodier. The mine wars escalated into something resembling an actual war. Thousands of armed miners marched on Logan County in 1921, facing off against company guards and federal troops. They called it the Battle of Blair Mountain, and it was the largest armed uprising in American labor history since the Civil War. All because of what started in Matewan. But here's the cruel twist that defines so many coal towns. Success planted the seeds of destruction. The very coal that made Matewan prosperous eventually ran out or became too expensive to extract profitably. The railway traffic slowed. The hotels closed their doors. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere. And the older generation watched their community slowly hollow out like a rotten log. Walking through downtown Matewan today feels like stepping into a time capsule that someone forgot to wind. The historic buildings remain, their brick facades still solid after more than a century. But peer through the windows and you'll see empty spaces where thriving businesses once operated. The old company store stands silent. Storefronts that once buzzed with activity now display faded, for rent signs that have been there so long they've become part of the architecture. The town tries to capitalize on its violent history through tourism. Visitors come to see where the famous gunfight happened, to walk the same streets where Sid Hatfield made his stand. There's even a trail that follows the path of those marching miners from 1921. But tourism can't replace the steady income that coal mining once provided. It's like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose. Population numbers tell the real story. What was once a bustling community of several thousand has dwindled to just a few hundred residents. The young leave for college and don't return. The middle-aged follow job opportunities to bigger cities. The elderly remain, guardians of memories and stories that risk dying with them. And the weird part is how the past refuses to stay buried in places like this. Local folklore insists that some participants in those long-ago feuds never really left these hollows. Strange encounters get reported near the old mine sites. Unexplained sounds echo through the hills on quiet nights. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's definitely something haunting about a place where so much blood was spilled over the simple right to organize and earn fair wages. The irony cuts deep when you think about it. Matewan became famous for a fight about workers' rights and economic justice. Now it's dying because those same economic forces moved on, leaving behind empty buildings and fading dreams. The miners won their battle but lost the war to time and changing markets. Yet even as Matewan slowly fades, its story connects to something much larger happening across Appalachia. Because sometimes, the most devastating damage to a community doesn't come from violence or dramatic disaster.